Two of the biggest, most important, and most expensive pieces of the Texans seem ready to rock for training camp. Laremy Tunsil and Tytus Howard will enter Texans training camp with no injury designation. That report coming thanks to KPRC, and that is huge for the Texans for a variety of reasons. One, both guys had off-season surgeries on their knees that caused them issues over the course of last year. Tunsil played with a knee injury basically the whole year long, and you remember the rotating cast at left tackle when he couldn't go, Josh Jones, Jaron Christian, Austin Deculus, among others. And then Tytus Howard, after his hand injury, when he came back and played left guard, he had the knee injury, unfortunately, into his season. Howard, I was more worried about than Tunsil. Tunsil, it felt like your typical knee injury cleanup after the offseason. That's never typical when they take a knife, cut into your body, and try to fix something. But most NFL players can sustain and handle that usual off-season cleanup of a bulky knee or something like that. I was worried about Howard because there was something in the surgery that ended his season to do with his patellar tendon. And when that is something that pops up in the conversation and surgery comes about, it got you a little worried about ultimately when Tytus Howard was going to return. But it feels like both these guys with no injury designation are going to be good to go from the jump. Now, I would tell you this. When you go to HoustonFootball.com and you read the training camp observations for the first day or the first week of training camp, or you're watching here on YouTube and you're paying attention, and I'm saying that they're not fully practicing, I wouldn't freak out. I wouldn't worry. You got a long training camp. If they're not practicing or not fully practicing by the middle of August, then you worry a little bit. These first few days, that little early ramp-up period for Tytus Howard and Laremy Tunsil, I'm not worried about that from a training camp perspective. Those guys have got to get down with the other likely and suspected first-teamers. They've got to get down the timing. Remember, Tytus Howard and Shaq Mason and Laremy Tunsil have never played together in a game at the positions they're set to play. Tytus Howard, when he came back from the injury, played left guard in large part because George Fant was playing so well at right tackle. Now, Howard's going to be the right tackle. Tunsil's going to be the left tackle. Mason is going to be the right guard. That's going to be the alignment that they worked on in training camp before Tytus Howard's injury in training camp last year, when he got hurt on the Sunday night practice and missed the first few weeks of the season dealing with that hand injury. So they need a little bit of timing and cohesion. I'm not worried about it. They've got plenty of time to get that together and figure out who that first team line is, get used to everything, get used to Joe Mixon, who is a new running back for them as well. What I am worried about is the five guys behind Laremy Tunsil or Tytus Howard. Look, Tytus Howard and Laremy Tunsil have had injuries drastically affect their seasons a bunch of times in their NFL careers with the Texans. Howard has had times where he's missed time because of a variety of different injuries. Obviously, Tunsil missed time. It was the hand a couple years ago. It was the knee last year. There have been times where they've missed and you've had to go to backups. Last year is a great example of that. The Texans had George Fant, a guy who'd played a lot of football, ready to go and step in, and Nick Caserio did a good job of adding him right around the start of training camp last year. They do not have a George Fant on this roster right now. The go-to backups right now would likely be second-round rookie Blake Fisher out of Notre Dame and Charlie Heck. And Heck, after he came back from his injury last year, he didn't play very well. In fact, he got benched in the middle of the game for George Fant at one point because of a poor performance in the game. And look, maybe Heck, with a real offseason, no injury to deal with, maybe he's better and more ready to go at this portion and this start of training camp. And maybe Fisher is going to be ahead of schedule. He was thought to be kind of a project player when you think about the draft evaluation, you think about the other names that were available. Maybe there were some more plug-and-play ready guys with a lower overall potential. The Texans opted for Fisher in what was a run of a lot of offensive linemen in the draft, and Fisher was thought to probably be a first-rounder if he'd stayed in college one more year. Well, he's going to get trial by fire while Laremy Tunsil and Tytus Howard aren't out there, or are they working back into a full practice situation? And those are the two main backups for the Houston Texans. The other three names that you need to know about is David Sharp, who comes over as a free agent from the Panthers. Didn't play a ton with Carolina, played a little special teams with them. He's bounced around a little bit in the league, been on a few different teams. Jalen Thomas is another name that you've got to know from an offensive line standpoint as a potential backup. And then Killian Zier, I believe I'm saying that right. He's the international designated player that the Texans have. So because he's from Germany, he gets to be like an extra piece of the roster. And Zier's a guy that played at Auburn, had a little bit of success at Auburn, was an undrafted free agent a year ago for the Texans. An injury ended his season, but the Texans kept him around, brought him back this year. So he's a factor in that backup situation. They've got 7 tackles on the roster. We know Tytus Howard and Laremy Tunsil are going to be on the roster, and we know Blake Fisher's going to be on the roster. So there's really only one tackle spot up for grabs between Charlie Heck and David Sharp and Jalen Thomas and Killian Zier, and that's going to be a fierce competition to figure that out. Now, those are the backups. Any of those guys plus Blake Fisher, it's a little scary. It does get me a little worried. It's one of the points about this Texans team that I worry about the most is, do they have enough tackle depth? Because a year ago, they had George Fant to break glass in case of emergency, and what do you know? They needed George Fant, and they broke the glass because they had the emergency of Tytus Howard getting hurt. They don't have a lot of guys on the interior offensive line who can bump out and play tackle. This is it. This is the offensive line room. Unless Nick Caserio's getting creative, maybe there's a Fant-esque signing around the start of training camp or the first few weeks of training camp. And remember, a year ago when they were a little light on offensive line help, Nick Caserio got active and got busy and was able to add Josh Jones and Kendrick Green before the season started. So those are options, but really ultimately you hope that Nick Caserio doesn't ever get to that point. You'd love Fisher to come in, showcase a lot of talent, showcase that he is ready in the near future, and then maybe have Charlie Heck come in with a healthy offseason under his belt and establish himself. But the big news from KPRC is no physically unable to perform list or anything like that for Laremy Tunsil and Tytus Howard. They are ready to rock with the start of training camp. And finally, we might be able to see one of the most expensive tackle duos in the NFL play tackle together since they became one of the most expensive tackle duos. I believe Philadelphia and Detroit are ahead of them for total money. Don't quote me on Detroit, but Taylor Decker's on, I think, his second contract, and then Penei Sewell obviously is a very, very rich man as well. So the Texans with at least one of the top 3 most expensive tackle duos in all of football. It'd be nice to see them on the field. You may not see them as much early on in training camp, but as training camp progresses, as they get to, I don't know, when the Rams are in town for joint practices, you should see 78, 71 out there ready to rock for the Texans. And that is really good news as training camp is ready to get started. Heck, you're probably watching this while training camp's going on. If you're watching this on Thursday, if that's the case, you need to follow the channel. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss anything about the Houston Texans this training camp this season. And we take it all in and give it to you here on the channel. So comment section, let me know. You thumbs up on Tytus Howard and Laremy Tunsil, ready to rock from day one here in training camp, or you're still a little hesitant that that's going to be the tackle duo for this team. They didn't draft Blake Fisher for nothing. Okay, that's something to keep an eye on as well. Appreciate you watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I can't wait until we talk Texans again soon.